Welcome to the Northpoint Guys podcast. My name is Michael Scott, and while we don't have Josiah Smith here helping me with this podcast today, we do have a special guest. I've been looking forward to this interview for some time. So this is Dr. Mike Caparrelli, one of our professors here, and who's also an incredible author, and we'll talk about his book Monster Mirror in a little bit because you've gotten quite some publicity about that. And so we're excited. Dr. Caparrelli, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me on. Awesome.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit, just like, who is Mike Caparrelli, just in a little snapshot? Who are you? I mean, what's your favorite food? Where are you from?
Yeah.
All that stuff.
Well, I'm from Providence, Rhode Island. If you don't know Providence, about an hour from Boston, 2.5 hours from New York. Grew up in Providence my whole life. Family started in New York City. Raised by a guy that was from the Bronx, so we go back and forth to New York a lot as a kid.
Yankees fan?
It's funny because in my house there was always a tension with Yankee, Red Sox. It depended. Like my grandfather was diehard Yankee fan. But I would say, me personally, I've been to more Yankee games than I have Red Sox games. I think I went to one Red Sox game and maybe 3 or 4 Yankees games.
Okay.
So
I'm a Yankee fan, so I had to ask.
I get it.
So,
Yeah.
all right.
I would say for me personally, more Yankees. I mean, I'm not really a baseball enthusiast. Grew up in a home where Christianity really wasn't, a thing. My dad was in prison as a kid. I would visit him, not for long periods of time, usually a year there, a year here. In Italian families, when dad goes to prison, the euphemism is college. So at 10, I'm like, Mom, where are we? She says, college. I said, what's he in college for? She says, law. So I thought, okay, he's in law school. Funny because my dad to this day, he's going to be 70. He'll say, when I was in college, I'm like, Dad, we're beyond that now. Like you weren't.
Dad, I understand.
I understand where you were. Yeah. So I didn't grow up Christian. I was on the wrong path through adolescence. At 17, I ended up in juvenile jail. While I was in juvenile detention center in Rhode Island, there was a minister by the name of Mike Krautman who just died maybe about 5 months ago, died of cancer. But he would go into the prison. He was a correctional officer, and he was a minister, and he would play worship songs with his guitar. And he shared the gospel with me. I can't say I got saved there, but the seed was planted.
Right.
Because right after my release, I had met another Christian, invited me to church. And at 18, I gave my life to Christ at North Providence Assembly of God, Pastor Manzo. And Pastor Manzo right away just took an interest in me and fathered me, discipled me, and I grew up in the faith at North Providence Assembly of God. Ended up enrolling in Zion in 1999 under Dr. Crandall. It was his last 2 years. And I was a student at Zion under Crandall the first 2 years, and then under George Cope the second 2 years. Ended up graduating in 2004 because I took a couple of years off in the middle somewhere. But yeah, I was a student at Zion. I mean, I remember being in the classes and not really having the reference points. I knew Noah's Ark. I mean, I just didn't have the reference points most of the students had. It was a miracle they even let me in. So Zion became a part of, too, my discipleship at a young age. I was definitely saved, prior. Loved the Lord, and never looked back. I just went forward from 18 years old, going forward now in the ministry. I was in Zion, graduated there in 2004, and then went on to Liberty, where you graduated, got your doctorate. Congratulations on that.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. So for those of us who know you now, or maybe somebody's meeting you for the first time, you're PhD in behavioral science. You are a professor at multiple colleges. You're an author. You speak nearly every Sunday at a different church or a different location. So knowing who you are now, if somebody knew the 18, 20-year-old Mike Caparrelli, student at Zion, would they have thought at all this is what you'd be doing? Like, what were you like back then as a student?
I was a work in progress. I mean, I got kicked out of Bible college my second year. I was saved growing up the way I did. It was a process. I had a temper, definitely always had an issue with anger early on. I don't know if somebody would have been able to see ahead of time. I mean, I remember one of the older students telling him, he was a senior, I was a sophomore, or I was a freshman, telling him that I was considering being a pastor. Mm-hmm. And he didn't have that eye to see the potential. And I remember him saying, I don't think you've got the temperament for that. So God certainly developed my character to get me to the point where I was. But no, initially I was a knucklehead.
Yeah. Were there any professors or people that really took you under their wing that you would look back and be like, man, they made a difference?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Dr. Gallagher was always, from the beginning, we've been close for, I don't know, over 20 years. Mm-hmm. He was always a father type. Back then, there was a guy named Lawrence Bodley. Mm-hmm. He actually, I remember him sitting down with me. He's talking about having a devotional life in class. This is late 90s. I didn't really understand that. I understood a little bit from being at North Providence, but I kind of was saved at North Providence, but almost afraid to ask that question, like, what do you mean devotions? Lawrence Bodley sits me down one day. He had a William Barclay commentary, mm-hmm. and he was a big fan of William Barclay. And he said, read this commentary every day. He says, spend some time in prayer. He said the commentary has the scripture in it, so you can get the scripture and then, an exposition of the scripture. And that's how I started doing my devotions in the late 90s at Zion, under the tutelage of Brother Bodley, teaching me what Barclay's commentary was all about, and just grew in my desire to understand the word.
Wow, I've heard great things about Brother Bodley.
Yeah.
Just, people holding him in such high esteem. And it's because of things like this.
Sure.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So going from being a student at Zion, so you graduate, and then did you go straight to being a pastor? Because you were a pastor for a bit. So were you going straight into full-time ministry, or what it kind of looked like at that time?
Well, my graduation day, this is really encouraging to students. I remember being a student in Zion and thinking, what am I going to do when I get my degree? Am I going to go back to a secular career? I was selling cars at the time. Am I going to sell cars? I just spent 4 years and all this money. Mm-hmm. At the time, it wasn't much money. It was probably, I don't know, $1,500 or $2,000 a semester. But in my mind, it was a lot of money. I had a family. I got married, had kids, little ones. And on my graduation day, my wife at the time had threw a party, and Pastor Manzo was sitting at the table at my graduation party. And he said, what are you going to do now? You got your degree. And I said, I don't know. He said, why don't you come work for me? And I started out as an associate pastor at North Providence Assembly of God, the very church that I was saved and raised in. I was associate pastor there for about 5.5 years. Actually served under him during the transition to Tony Pallo. Mm-hmm. I actually brought Tony Pallo on. Pastor Manzo had said what he was looking for in the next pastor. He wanted somebody with at least 15 years experience in ministry, and he had this criteria. And I looked at the criteria and I said, Tony Pallo's the guy for the job. And he said, who's he? I said, get a hold of Tony Pallo. He's a teacher at Zion. He's the guy for this job. So he takes Tony Pallo off at dinner. Tony preaches at the church, and Pastor Manzo called me later that night, and he said, you are an excellent judge of character. He said, this is the guy for the job. And took Tony a little bit to seek God and find out he was the right person for it. So Tony is now on staff as the pastor, lead pastor, and I was under him for a couple of years. And then close to the 6-year point, they launched us out with 15 people initially, then sent us out another 10 to plant the church in Warwick, Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. And we grew that from 25 to, 250 roughly, bought some property and pastored there for a good close to 11 years. Mm-hmm. So.
Wow. So when, during all this, did you really start working with people with like chemical addictions and those kind of things?
Well, that was right away. Being in North Providence, I had already seen the model, the prototype of the kind of church that I knew I was called to pastor. People that were from the streets, those that were caught up in addiction, reacclimating to society from prison.
Right.
I'd already been sort of involved in prison ministry. I was always involved in prison ministry because that was my background, being in the juvenile detention at 17, my dad being in prison. So I always had a heart for inmates. So our church right away, Sacred Exchange, had started a 12-step group on Tuesday nights. That became a threshold into the church. It's one of the ways the church grew. did ministry in the prison in Rhode Island. Like we went in there, did a Bible study, did a men's group. And all my sermons were always kind of geared towards mental health, recovery. And we just became known as that church, the hospital for the sick.
Right.
You know, the church that people go with, then, you know, those that are not wanted anywhere else. So that was my passion early on.
Mm-hmm. Nice. I was going to ask this later, but I'll ask it now.
Yeah.
I mean, because now at Northpoint, you're teaching classes, you're investing in future pastors and future ministers. And, you know, we may have some current pastors who are watching right now or listening online. So what do you wish pastors knew about ministering to those with addictions that maybe they have no idea right now? Maybe they've never, you know, even thought about ministry to, you know, people coming out of prison for their church. You know, what are some things that you wish pastors knew when it came to ministering to, you know, those who come out of prison, those who come out of addictions, those who are dealing with those things?
Well, that was actually my dissertation. My PhD was behavioral science. It was a 7-year program. It was 123 credit hours.
Wow.
So I was doing my PhD full time in pastoring. But when I was finished with the coursework, took 5 years. Then I had to begin my research, because when you complete your PhD, you have to conduct research and complete it into a dissertation. And my dissertation question was, what is the church doing to help and hurt those in recovery from addictions? So I went around all of New England interviewing people that were in recovery, gathering the data, so to speak, data collection. And I asked that question: how has church helped your recovery, and how has it hurt your recovery? And, you got the typical answers as far as how it helped. I need to feel like I belong. I need to be a part of something, like give me something to do while I'm here. But there was a fine line, or a tightrope, that pastors have to walk when it came to what I gathered in the research. And it made sense, because it agreed with my own anecdotal experience working with people in recovery, is if you gave someone in recovery a responsibility in the church, and it didn't properly match their skill set, their competence, their spiritual maturity, then it could become a relapse factor.
Wow.
So it was one of the findings of a lot of the people that I talked to in recovery that was reported in my dissertation, which is now published in academic journals. It's called The Impact of Church on Recovery of Those with Chemical Addictions. And they basically said, if I'm in a position, if you give me a job in the church, let's say I'm I'm out of the streets a few months, and now I'm in the church, and I haven't maybe picked up in 6 months, but you give me a job and it's too much for me, I get too stressed. Now I start to feel ashamed. I feel like I'm not producing. I think I'm letting you down.
Right.
That kind of thought process became a quick trigger towards relapse and going back into addiction. So pastors have to be careful,
right,
to really assess, where is this person? Can they handle this? Does this match their aptitude? Does it match their skill set? Does it match spiritual maturity? Do they have the grace for the place? Because if they don't have the grace for the place, that became a recipe for disaster.
So a pastor can think that they're discipling and doing the right thing, but it can actually trigger them back to relapsing.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it goes back to what Paul said. Be careful that you take a young convert and elevate him too soon.
Right.
He becomes conceited, and it could lead to some kind of collapse or fall. So that was one of the big findings.
Wow. So while you're pastoring, while you're working on your PhD, I mean, you have a website which we'll, definitely want to promote and want people to go to. So you have a total of 5 books now that you've been writing over this time. And so what kind of inspired you to start writing? Because I mean, you're preaching, you're working on your schoolwork, you're doing all this. Why write books?
Well, I had resigned from pastoring first. I had really just burnt out. I got real tired in ministry. I had suffered 2 heart attacks. My first heart attack was a minor heart attack. My second was the widowmaker. Wow. Which is the main artery clogging. And that heart attack kills 83% of the people. It killed my grandfather at 45. So I had the second heart attack. At the time, I'm in my early 40s. And I said, I think it's time for me to step down from pastoring. I really felt the grace to do it lift.
Right.
You know, the grace to do something, when it lifts, it's like the wearing off of Novocaine. Like when Novocaine wears off, you feel the pain.
Right.
You're like, oh my goodness. Pain was always there.
Yeah.
But the Novocaine anesthetize or numb the pain. Grace does that. Grace makes a difficult task easier. It makes a challenging place more bearable. But when that grace lifts, it's like everything was bothering me as a pastor. The people were bothering me. I'm like, I gotta go. I'm fantasizing about how relaxing jail is. I mean, that's a sign that you're burnt out.
Yeah.
You're like visiting people in a psych ward and you're saying, how long do they let you stay here? Do they have extra beds in this place? What do you say to get in?
Yeah. These walls look comfortable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm thinking, I the grace to do this is definitely lifting. I resign by the providence of God. When I resigned, it was the same time that the PhD was completed. So that opened up doors.
Right.
You know, churches were wanting me to speak on mental health subjects within the church from my education and my ministerial experience. I decided to write because of the need. I see how many churches are in need of mental health from a biblical perspective. So I ended up writing, you know, a book a year. My first book was in 2019. It was on recovering from trauma from a biblical perspective, called Pen Your Pain in the Parables. That was in 19. Then in 20, I wrote a second book, Dr. Jesus. Third year, 2021, Surviving Feelings. And then 2022, Ox in the Ass. So I completed the 4 books, 1 book a year.
Wow.
Yeah.
So now let's get to your most recent book, Monster Mirror. So for those who haven't heard about it or those who are interested in checking out, you spent 100 hours interviewing David Berkowitz, who many in the Northeast would recognize more so by his name, Son of Sam, you know, committed atrocious murders, you know, back in the day, and is kind of a well-known, you could say, serial killer. So
largest manhunt in New York City history.
Wow. And so, I mean, first of all, what connected you to David? How did that start? Where did that passion come from for telling that story in particular? And then even kind of walk us through that process. Because, I mean, yeah, like I know you, but I'm blown away by this story and the access you had. But you were also able to convey David as like, hey, he's a believer. He loves Jesus. And while people may know him as a murderer, he is saved and going to heaven. And so what kind of led you to telling his story and spending those hours with him?
Well, like I said, growing up, visiting Dad in prison, already there was a compassion for people that were in prison, and then my own experience. Then my education, the PhD, you know, there's a focus on criminal psychology. I teach psychology courses here. I teach criminal psychology at the community college. So I already had the education or the training in that area. I mailed David a book, one of my books, Dr. Jesus. I'd seen his story on the 700 Club. I was curious because I had already spent time with 2 other serial killers, one out of Massachusetts and one out of Rhode Island, doing prison ministry. But both of those men were religious or jailhouse conversions. They weren't very sincere. They used faith, but it was more to impress a parole board. So those relationships came to an impasse. I couldn't really go any further. Too many psychopathic games. It just wasn't going anywhere. David, I sensed something different. I said, this guy seems like he really knows Christ. And I want 2 things. I want to understand what was behind the crimes. Right. Because we're living in a day where there are mass shootings, school shootings on the regular. There are 13 a week in America. You don't hear about all of them, but there are 13 mass shootings a week. Right. So I want to understand the psychology behind that. But then I also want to understand the transformation. Tell me about your conversion. So I mailed David Berkowitz a copy of my book in 2021, Dr. Jesus, and he mails me back shortly and says, I've been waiting for a guy like you that has both an understanding of the supernatural as well as an education in psychology to really explain the psychological breakdowns that were happening in my mind back in the 70s. If you don't know, David Berkowitz gunned down 13 people, largest manhunt in New York City, history ever. The city was in a state of fear. He was not only killing, but he was leaving letters on top of the bodies, taunting the media and the police to catch him. So the city was just in a state of fear. Anybody from New York would tell you it was just in a state of fear. My stepdad was from the Bronx, not far from where David grew up. And my stepdad remembers the stories very well. So David is arrested in 1977, been incarcerated 46 years, but he was saved in 1988. And in the last 35 years, the transformation of a psychopath, which, you know, in our cancel culture, it's said that psychopaths are irredeemable. Hollywood paints that picture. The data in the clinical community says that psychopaths make very little headway in progress. It's almost useless for a psychopath to get therapy. They don't have remorse. They don't experience empathy. So the idea of a psychopath being transformed, the kind of guy that society says and the clinical community says it's impossible to redeem.
Right.
That was attractive to me because to me that showcases the miraculous power of God. So David invites me to the prison. This is late 2021. We write back and forth. And then on April 1st, 2022, marked my first visit with David Berkowitz behind bars at Shorgunk. And it was the first visit among 34 visits, the longest analysis ever done on David Berkowitz. A criminologist by the name of David Abrahamson in the 80s met with him for 50 hours. But that was a Freudian perspective, nothing to do with Christianity.
Right.
I doubled that time and wrote this book called Monster Mirror that covers not only the crimes, what was behind the crimes, the mental health factors, the demonic influences, but also covers his transformation over the last 35 years.
Yeah. So I imagine there's a lot of people, especially if they're old enough to know the stories of David in New York City, but I'm sure there are a lot of people with preconceived notions about David and wanting, you know, I bet here's the conclusion of this research. I would imagine, though, that you probably had some ideas of like, oh, this is where the story's going to go. Were there anything specifically, I'm trying to say, was there anything specific that maybe you were surprised by in your research and what came out?
Yeah, well, the title says it all. I call it Monster Mirror because I was expecting when I hear about David, you know, when he was on the streets, I'm going to hear about a monster.
Right.
But instead I see a mirror. I end up realizing that the themes that were gathered from the data, there were 9, were themes that resonated with most people. It wasn't this recipe that was exclusive to serial killers. Like if you watch any criminal psychology show, it's always, you know, bedwetting, animal cruelty, lighting fires, all these characteristics that, well, that's not me. That's not my son. But with David, you know, the themes that I extrapolated from the data, shame, resentment, isolation, stuff that, you know, I look at me, I look at culture, I look at society, and I realize that this line between the psychopath and the population is a lot more illusory or thinner than we even imagine. I believe that there's a hidden psychopath in everybody. Now, that conclusion flies in the face of our culture because our culture says we're humanistic. We're good people, and people like this are something else. The Bible says the heart of man, there's only one nature. It's human nature. It's not like the human nature and then the serial killer nature. No, it's human nature. And out of that is a limitless potentiality for evil. I'm not alone in saying this message in the psychological community. Right now, there's a guy named Dr. Jordan Peterson, who I met with a month ago, put the book in his hands. He's reading it. And that's one of his messages right now in the psychology community, is that we're not these wonderful people. If you resent someone, you spend 6 months brooding over your resentments. You spend 6 months pulling away from community, 6 months berating yourself with shame. You might evolve into someone that you'd never thought you'd evolve into. The possibility of the iniquitous or the sinful nature is endless. So that was the most surprising finding of the book is David Berkowitz is not the monster from the abyss. He's the boy next door. And he is really exhibiting qualities that we all exhibit, but taken too far, allow those qualities to, you know, ripen, let iniquity ripen, and you'd be shocked at what you'd be capable of doing.
Wow. Now, this book, since it's been released, you've had great response. You know, I don't know how many you've sold, but I imagine
it's been in thousands.
I was about to say quite a few.
Yeah.
And even it's put you on platforms like the 700 Club and everything. And so I can't imagine even the doors that are going to be open coming up. So I think you're in a unique perspective with your ministry background and your ministry education, but also your psychology background and your psychology education and your research and everything. I feel like often in the ministry world, we separate psychology and theology. And it's like, one, it seemed like doesn't appreciate the other as much.
Maybe. That's science in general.
Yeah.
The Christian community is always skeptical towards science.
Exactly.
Which is sad because it's God's design. Why not learn about it?
Yeah. So how, or what would you say to marry these two perspectives? Because really they're intertwined. Like you said, God created these things. He created psychology. He created the human brain, and that's what it's studying. And
exactly.
So how do you marry these two in ministry? And how do you get pastors to understand, hey, there's this world of psychology that you need to understand. Your people are dealing with this. And then how do you get the science world to understand the spiritual side of things? Because with David, I would say that was crucial to what was happening with David. Most was definitely. The spiritual demonic influence. Mm-hmm. So how do you marry these two from both perspectives?
Well, I understand the church's skepticism towards psychology because a lot of the psychology, or at least its solutions, are hogwash. Mm-hmm. You got to wonder, why is America leading the way with mental health issues, and we have more therapists and we have more psychotropic drugs than any nation in the world? So the church's skepticism towards the clinical community, in my opinion, is justifiable. Because if the clinical community was the answer, why is there such a mental health crisis in our country? Now, on the other hand, when I talk the study of psychology, all I'm talking about is the study of the human makeup.
Right.
If you can appreciate the study of the stars or animals or anatomy or whatever, why not try to understand all we've learned about the development of the brain, about the role of the brain behind human behavior? So much of psychology is biology. So understanding the biology of it, why would we be resistant to that? I understand being resistant to the solutions the psychological community comes up with, but I'm all for embracing the science because God created man. Mm-hmm. He made us in a certain way. Now, the more you understand psychology, now I sat through the PhD program for, 7, 8 years or whatever it was. I had my Bible in one hand and Freud and Erikson and Bandura and Maslow and Jung and all these other psychologists in the other hand. And I couldn't believe how much I was finding in the Bible that I began to realize the Bible's the greatest psychology book ever written.
Yeah.
I don't read it, it reads me. It's not just an exploration of God's character, but it's also a divulging of man's makeup. It confronts the sinner in me and it unleashes the winner in me. The image of Adam, the nature of Adam, the sinful nature, and the imago Dei, the image of God. The Bible's depiction of mankind is spot on. Now, when you read guys like Freud, Erikson, Bandura, Jung, these guys were under a Christian Judeo worldview. Don't think for a second that some of the truths they quote unquote stumbled upon weren't part of what's actually in the scriptures. So if you sit through one of my psychology classes at Northpoint, you'll begin to see how much depth of understanding of the human nature is in the Bible, but then later plagiarized by guys like Jung and Freud. Now, they contributed, by the way. All truth is God's truth, wherever you find it. Mm-hmm. These guys definitely contributed in understanding to, for instance, the subconscious and how it affects us. But I can bring you to 50 verses in the Bible that speak of the subconscious. It may not say the subconscious, that particular term, but the concept of the Bible, of the heart being like deep waters, or the heart being like a storehouse, or the idea that early childhood affects how we live out adulthood, raise up a child in the way that they should go. Later on, they won't depart from it. What way? What do we mean by that? Well, guys like Freud elaborated on some of that. So the Bible and psychology, when it's handled right, if it's handled correctly, I think one will begin to see that there is a psychology in the Bible and that there's a psychology that's been elaborated on by scholars in that field. And we have to go about it in a discerning fashion, eat the meat, spit out the bones. but learn all you can learn about human nature. I mean, God made us. Why be resistant to that? You know, I'll be honest. I think some pastors, not all, most of the ones I know are very warm towards me. I've built relationships with 50 churches.
Right.
And a lot of those pastors call me for consultation. I do workshops in their church. I mean, I've developed some really good friendships with some powerful men of God across the country. But I've met a few that are intimidated by it. It's almost like they have to have the answers on dealing with the problems of the human soul. And I think deep down inside, they don't know what to do with the mental health crisis in their church. But it would do them well to open up a little bit, not to me personally, but to someone maybe that has my education, because it could serve their church to have a specialist in that particular area.
Right. Wow. Yeah. Now, as we wrap up, and you just mentioned your class at Northpoint again, why, you know, with these new platforms and new books and education and 700 Club and all that, why are you still teaching at Northpoint? What excites you about, not just because you were a student at Zion, now Northpoint, but what excites you about having a classroom of future pastors and getting to share this kind of stuff?
Well, they're going into the ministry. That's their goal when they come to Northpoint. And as I tell the students all the time, you're going to be dealing with people.
Yeah.
By all means, have a solid prayer life. You know, pray, fast, all the spiritual disciplines. You should know God, but you should know people. And if you don't know how to handle people, and you don't know the intricacies of human nature and how to deal with, you know, the human nature successfully, your church is never going to reach the potential that it has. It's never, I don't care if listen, prayer warrior is important, but if you're a prayer warrior and you have no social skills, you're a prayer warrior and you have no EQ, emotional intelligence, no intuition, no ability to relate to people, that church is going to be stuck. It's not going to go far. Most of the pastors I know that are doing very well in ministry, not only do they know God, but they have a know-how with people. So I'm trying to instill in these students a better understanding of human nature, which is going to make them more effective in the ministry, which is going to build the kingdom of God, and is going to lead to the discipleship of the people that are in their congregation. That's what I'm trying to put inside of them, is an understanding of human nature. They're getting lots of great theology classes where they know God. When they come to my class, of course they should know God through my class as well, but hopefully they come out with a better understanding of knowing people.
Yeah. And I know it's impacting them. I mean, your classes are always filled. You know, students love taking them. And then, but I'm even seeing in the youth and kids ministry classes I teach, they're bringing in stuff that they learn from you. And I love that. That makes me smile all the time.
That's cool.
And I'm like, man, where'd you learn that? That's brilliant. They're like, oh, Dr. Caparrelli. Yeah. And so I love that. And so as we wrap up, where can, you know, our viewers, our listeners find your books, find more about you, and even maybe book you to speak at their church?
Well, if you want to book me, you can find me on Facebook. I'm very active presence there. Just look up Mike Caparrelli. Don't look up my dad's page. He's got the same name.
He went to college.
Different content, much different content on his page. But look up Mike Caparrelli on Facebook. You can go to unmuted.app, A-P-P. Unmuted is the name of the ministry. Or you could go on Amazon if you want to buy the book, Monster Mirror, 100 Hours of David Berkowitz. You can get any of my books on Amazon. And through Facebook or the website would be the best places.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in more about Northpoint, you could always go to northpoint.edu. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, even follow the Northpoint guys on Instagram as well. And make sure you follow this guy, Mike Caparrelli. It's so great having you. I'm so thankful you're part of the Northpoint family.
Doing a great job, Dean. Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. And thank you, and we'll see you next time.